that helps really make a difference, and it's driven not just the change for those retailers and their future, but it's created a massive difference in their communities. We'd love to tell you more about the Access for All project and how we've helped those businesses, and hope that we might be able to bring some of their work, some of their achievements to your attention to celebrate all that is good in retail, and there is still so much that is good in retail. Within the last 18 months, I've actually been able to put faces to two names that I've certainly heard on the radio and seen on the TV and thought, why haven't I been booked for that? No, they've done a great job. I really am absolute fans, big fans of both of these gentlemen that joined me this morning, Andrew Busby and Richard Lynn. So I wanted to bring us together to sort of do a State of the Nation chat. I know that we've got different views, but I know wholesomely and overall we all three agree in the very bright future that's ahead, and yet the very hard work that's necessary to make sure that we all get there. So without further ado, I think I'm welcoming Richard onto the stage, who's going to give a 3-minute chat. Then you'll hear from Andrew, then myself, and then we're going to have this fireside chat where we've got some pre-prepared questions that we'd really like to hear from yourself. Hope you get lots from it. We're here just to big brains to pick at, and thank you very much for coming once again.
Thank you, Kate. Oh, Mike Thomas. Yeah, so as Kate's kind of set the scene, we thought we'd just give a 3-minute view from each of us, because we're all approaching retail from a different angle. My background is as an economist, and retail economics is essentially about putting economic analysis, modelling and forecasting at the heart of the retail sector and our view on consumers. So it's quite a different blend of approaches. But for me, I think the industry is going through unprecedented change at the moment. And it's no exaggeration to say that there's a kind of a paradigm shift in what's happening within the sector. And we talk a lot about the impact of online, and online accounts for 20% of the retail sector at the moment, but we expect that to continue to accelerate, and that will cause retailers to continually look at their business models and try to pivot towards something that's more digital and something that's more experience-led as well. We actually think, for example, that online will continue to grow. We think that online will account for 50% of non-food within the next 10 years. A lot of that growth is going to be driven by those demographic shifts. So in 10 years' time, Generation Z and millennials will account for the majority of the consumer population. So these are digital natives where online shopping habits are deeply ingrained into their shopping behaviour. So we expect to see that continue, but also the fact that experiences, and specifically the experience economy, has become more pronounced. And so consumers are essentially looking at economic value, and the way that they attach economic value to material possessions has changed. And actually the economic data supports that. We used to spend about a third of our expenditure on retail products. That fell to about a quarter. We expect that it's a third in the 1960s. That fell to about a quarter around 2017. We expect that to fall further as this shift and attentions focus more towards experiences and leisure. And all of these seismic shifts that we're seeing within the way that consumers are spending their money is colliding with rising operating costs for retailers. So business rates continues to be a significant burden on the industry, national living wage, national minimum wage, the apprenticeship levy, utility bills, all of that is squeezing margins. So actually, if you look at the top 150 retailers in the UK, over the last 10 years, pre-tax profit margins have actually halved. And this is putting profitability under pressure, and this is really putting, in context of those wider structural changes, this is really putting business models under pressure. But going back to the positive things, there are retailers that continue to thrive. Look at Primark, look at JD Sports, Selfridges, Aldi, Lidl. There's lots of retailers that are putting customers at the heart of their customer journey. They're understanding to have a point of difference within the market. They stand for something, and they're essentially providing a unique proposition that resonates with their core customer base. So there's lots of opportunities out there, and a lot of those opportunities are presented because of this disruption. And we'll talk more about that later. Thank you. Andrew, please.
Thank you. I'll stand up and we sat here. Good morning, everybody. I for the moment, I agree with all of that. I'm sure we'll disagree a bit later. But I think I'll start by saying that retail is the most fantastic sector. I guess you wouldn't be here unless you kind of agreed generally with that statement. And the reason why I say that is because it is so relevant to all of us. And what I mean by that is that we're all consumers, we're all shoppers. And it's not like we have relationships with our favourite brands, if you like. And I think we probably saw, in some of the reactions from the news yesterday, there seemed to be an awful lot of affection for the Thomas Cook brand, and we've seen that before. We saw that in 2008 with Woolworths, just to name a couple. So retail brands, we have relationships with which we don't with, say, our utility companies or telcos. You switch on the light and that's it. You don't need to have any more of an emotional attachment, if you like. So for me, retail is the most relevant sector, and kind of moving on from that, which we're going to discuss, is there's an awful lot we know which is talked and written about the high street, and the high street is dying and retail apocalypse and so on and so forth. But for me, it's more of an evolution. It's not necessarily a revolution, and there are going to be winners and losers, as in anything. And it's almost as if it's it's Darwinism on the high street, and the weak are not going to survive, and there is this kind of natural culling that's going on. But the key thing for me is that the high street has relied on retail for a long, long time, and it probably will do for the foreseeable future, although we know that is changing. The mix on the high street is changing. And the high street forms the centre of our communities. And that's why all this matters. Our town centres kind of equals the high street and vice versa, and that's the centre of our community, where we gather, where we socialise, where we mix, where we eat, where we drink, where we shop, etc., etc. And before I finish, and that's kind of why, shameless plug time, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's why I wrote my new book, which came out 10 days ago, I think, on Amazon. And it's called Harry Was Right All Along. Now, you probably guessed already who the Harry was, but I'll just briefly go into that. So I took the inspiration from what, if you go back 100 years to what Harry Selfridge was saying. And what he was saying then is what a lot of people now are saying, and would have us believe that it's all new. And what I'm talking about is the experience economy. I hate the term experiential retail, but I'm sure everybody here knows what I mean when I say that. But if you go back over 100 years to 1909, when Selfridges was born, Harry Selfridge was talking just that. He wanted people to come into the store. He wanted them to socialise, to enjoy their time there. If they bought something, that was great, but they didn't have to, because hopefully they had such a good time that on the next occasion they came, they'd want to come back, and then they'd buy something on that next occasion. And that, I think, is probably a lesson, even though it's over 100 years ago, that all retailers today can still learn from. So I'll sit down now, we'll get into our chat, and I'm sure we'll kind of get into some of these themes in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
You had one job, Andrew. One job. Introducing me.
And I'm going to introduce now Kate.
Goodness me. So all three of us had decided we would have a passion topic that we were going to talk about in our introduction. And as I say, there's a lot of complementary views, but sometimes we disagree. I don't think any of us disagree on the fact that customer service is on the decline. Satisfaction surveys are on the decline. And this is an instant, immediate win most businesses can make tomorrow. And I really struggle when I'm talking to consumers week in, week out to hear of their disappointment, their disenfranchisement with brands who then will spend oodles on social media campaigns to drive people to their sites and to their stores. We really can make such a big win by getting people to engage with people. But there's a challenge to this, and that's we need to teach people how to engage with people once more. Our millennials are really struggling with the idea of eye-to-eye conversations and head-to-head, face-to-face contact. It's just not within a comfort zone. So it's so important that we invest. We've got to invest in our teams. If you speak to, I was just covering the M&S story this morning about the FD standing down. If you speak to any M&S customer, they talk about bodies on the floor, they talk about service, they talk about engagement. If we're going to bring retail to life, and this is exactly what's happening in those independent retailers that we're supporting, 1,000 over 10 years, we have just built them on brilliant service and expertise. This is something I want to drive back, and it has to be customer service ready for 2020 and beyond. It can't be of old, but I absolutely believe it is an instant win. It is wonderful for retailers and businesses to invest millions into the future of technology. I read that in every single report that we have to go through before we comment on it in the news. However, what I don't hear is what's happening in the short term. And we all know this is a game of creating the candelabras and also working on the tea lights so that we can provide light for the future right here, right now. There is no noise in the stores and online about how things are improving, what changes are being made, what improvements have been made that week or that year for those customers to take reassurance. I used to love Juicens because behind every Juicens counter within stores, the trader builders would make a promise to the consumer on walking through the door of what they could come to expect. I think it's time to bring back the customer promise. I think it's time to accept that this is a relationship built on a contract, and we as retail and with other people within the service sector as well, health and beauty, which is another sector I work in, travel, we all have to be upfront about the promise we're going to make and deliver on that promise. And if we fall short of that, we have to accept that. Let's not just create the over-promise and under-deliver. Let's actually start working honestly and respectfully. Because if you look behind the lines of any single consumer survey, that is exactly what they're asking for. Respect and honesty. I think there's huge hope for retail. I know it has to be with all the bells and whistles, and I believe in tech too. But we've got to go back to some of the decent, fundamental human principles that retail service industry was always about. Let's make people feel special about their spend once more. I'm going to introduce the fireside chat. Who's kicking us off?
Well, that's my second job.
Okay, go on then.
So I mentioned what Harry Selfridge was talking about in terms of experience, and you mentioned it there. And so what I really wanted to just ask both of you, first of all, was about measuring experiences, and is it that important in retail? Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think experiential retail is great. I'm not sold on the idea of neon ping pong in the dark. I don't think it has to go that far and wide unless you're particularly a brand on the cutting edge. I think what we do terribly in retail is we look over the shoulder too much, see what's happening behind us, and then copy paste. And that isn't then with the filter of, is that relevant to our brand? Is that actually right for our consumer base? So whilst I'm glad we've moved out of the cheese and wine era, I still think there's so much to do that is about fitting the experience for purpose and fitting it for the brand and the audience you're working with. And actually, I would much rather, as I've just been saying, go in and have a wonderful customer service experience 7 days a week rather than an awesome experience 1 day of the week. I think you've got to balance both.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I guess I'd almost take a bit of a step back and almost look at why experiences have become so much more important for consumers. And in many ways, I genuinely believe that there's been a fundamental shift in the way that consumers perceive material possessions. We've essentially had 2 decades of importing deflation from China and many other countries, where we've had prices that have consistently fallen for key sectors such as clothing and footwear, electricals, homewares. And it's almost led to an abundance of material possessions. And so I think everyone can relate to the fact that, I've got an iPhone 10, I've probably had about 6 iPhones now over the years. The first iPhone that I had, I attached economic value to. It changed my life, quite frankly. You can get it on the internet, on the move and things like that. The second iPhone, third iPhone, fourth iPhone, the economic value that I attached to each iPhone diminished, and it diminished over time. And I think if you take that concept across material possessions throughout the economy, because we've had this consistent fall in prices and rising living standards, it has left people wanting something more. It's left them wanting something different, and it's left them wanting experiences. And I kind of referenced this earlier, where actually the economic data supports this in terms of households are spending less of a proportion of their expenditure on retail products. They're spending more on experiences. Retailers realise that, and they have shifted business models accordingly, and so they're offering services, digitalisation of products and things like that. But also the fact that, going back to as a direct answer to your question, I think that you can measure experiences through different realms of experiences, and so we call these our kind of our 4 E's, if you like. Environment is really important, education, escapism, and entertainment. And actually, everyone, these aren't discrete choices for retailers. Consumers want a blend of all of these different realms of experiences, depending on age, depending on what you're buying, depending on price point and things like that. But actually, there is a kind of a way to really enhance the in-store experience, dovetailing with the digital experience by having digital touch points in store and linking up that customer journey, where I think experiences and digital can be at the heart of that.
It has to be relevant to you.
Yeah.
Because the turnaround plan of a major department store 3 years ago was, we're going to put brow bars and hairdryer blow bars in, and you just think, well, everyone's already doing that. That it has to be relevant to you. It has to be new. It has to be different. It can't just be one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. When you were just saying that, I was thinking. So I went up on the opening day for Primark's new store in Birmingham. Which has anybody else been to see them? Have a look at that. It's worth a look, because that's quite an interesting one for me, because you walk into that store and it's what you don't expect to see a nail bar and a barber's and a lady's hairdresser and so forth. And I'm kind of, I'm still, I think, making my mind up about that as to whether, does that fit with the brand, and is that just going to be a one-off? Well, actually, if you look at some of the other stores, Madrid would be a good example, where it's a similar sort of thing. But it's something I found quite fascinating, because it's not something you expect to see from the brand, but it gives you that, and it's. Part of our business is also the psychology of the consumer, and one of the things from psychologists is that the memory of the experience is more important than the experience itself. Which is one of the lessons that I'm also glad you didn't mention omnichannel there, by the way, Richard. You mentioned physical, because for me there's no such thing as omnichannel. But I found, I don't know if anybody here knows, the person who first coined that phrase. It was for a Harvard Business Review in 2011, a guy called Darryl Rigby, and I contacted Darryl and said, "What's all this about?" But it was just that. It was what you described, physical and the online. Can I just come on to technology? There's so much out there, and I spend half of my life, it seems, attending various expos and conferences and so on and so forth. And I always think, if I'm a retailer attending one of these, unless I'm on a particular mission to procure something, I could get completely lost with this. So Richard, what are your views on, how is technology changing and perhaps transforming the customer journey?
I think from a customer perspective, the smartphone essentially has been that one device, that one portal that can take people and merge the physical and digital realms, where people, put it this way, customers don't think in channels, do they? They kind of seamlessly bounce between digital and physical, and often at the same time as well, to make their path to purchase relevant to them. But I think in terms of the smartphone, that is the piece of technology that's absolutely fundamentally changed the customer journey. And of course, smartphone penetration has increased across the population over the years, but it's really had the most significant impact has been at the very beginning of the customer journey, when we're being made aware of products, we're researching products that could be in store, and of course social media has had a significant influence. So, and if you look at some of the brands like ASOS, I think 9 million Instagram followers, Boohoo have got about 7 million. Brands like Zara have got 33 million Instagram followers. And this allows brands and retailers to have a direct conversation with their customers, control that narrative, inspire them. But customers, and actually our research shows that customers, especially the Gen Zs and millennials, they still want the physical experience. They still want to go into store. They still want to touch and feel. And going back to your point about it's the experience and the memory of the experience that's so important to build brand awareness, to build brand equity, to increase loyalty, to increase the purchase frequency and things like that. But the piece of technology for me is the smartphone that's really fundamentally changed the customer journey beyond recognition.
Just on that then, before we come to you, Kate, so where do you think, and I don't know the answer to this, but where do you think we're going with the smartphone? What are we still going to have a smartphone in 10 years? Is it going to be something different?
Yeah, I mean the kind of directional trend, I think, is that we will continue to have more powerful devices. I think 5G could potentially be a game changer in terms of the content that we're served on these devices. Wearable tech, again, is one of those areas where you can see it having applications and the more streamlined and kind of frictionless use of things like AR and VR. Again, it has to be relevant, it has to be useful, but the IKEA app, for example, where you can see what a table might look like in your front room using augmented reality, that's a practical and good use of technology, but I can just see that being the direction of travel.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's been so much cash wasted in Emperor's New Clothes types of dreams for technology. So I read about a piece where I went to actually go and speak to the retailer about the development of it, and it was a very big high street fashion brand, and the idea was that this mirror would come up and you would put in that you were going to a wedding on Saturday, and it would say, well, it's going to be raining on Saturday, and actually within this postal area a lady's already bought this dress, so you might actually have the same dress as someone else at the wedding. You might not, but you might. And you just think, when are you testing this about, the fact I can pick up my own smartphone and find out what the weather's going to be, and there's so much competition out there, I'm probably not going to be wearing the same as everyone else. It's got to have the sanity check of, do they want it? Is it going to help? Is it going to make a difference? And apart from the smartphone, I'm asked, which pieces of technology are life-changing, which have made a difference, which have been relevant to brand. And the example I always give in terms of the success is something called the Disney Magic Band. So if you go into Walt Disney World in Florida, obviously not if you go with Thomas Cook, but if you did, you are offered, and if you stay there, something that looks like a watch. But this is the key to your room, it's your charging facilities, it is your park access, it is the device that's going to tell you how long the queues are on all the rides and which way to go to. It's going to tell you which restaurants to eat at. This is smart technology. This is also making sure your consumers go exactly where you want when you want them and give you all the data you need. But for them, it's benefit. And this is what I always speak to tech companies about when we're asked to get involved. What is the benefit to the consumer? What's the BFU? And if there are enough of them, then they are rewarded to use it. But if you think you're just going to come up with some hocus pocus and it's smart but it's actually not common sense, it won't be used. And I worry about how much lost investment we've made there at the loss of the opportunity to something else.
Yeah.
What do you?
Yeah. I mean, for me in retail, I think that artificial intelligence, AI, the take-up has still been relatively slow, but it is starting, and it's and across the piece, you can imagine in from the back office, from supply chain right the way through to self-service checkout and whatever. Now, one of the more bizarre examples I saw quite recently. Has anybody seen I think it's who owns the Oral-B brand? Procter & Gamble, I think it is. Anyway, P&G seem to think that we're going to spend the best part of £180 on a toothbrush which has AI built into it. So I saw this. I think it was launched in the States in around March this year, and then I think it's this month in this country. And I thought, because I think that AI will be embedded pretty much in most of retail operations, in particular with personalisation. But I saw this, and I thought, well, how does it work? And apparently it maps how you brush your teeth, and then supposedly will tell you how you can more effectively and efficiently brush your teeth. And that's for 180 quid, if you really think. But yeah, exactly. But interesting that's the kind of line of direction. And I think personalisation, yeah, I think today, I think in 5 years' time, we'll look back at 2019, 2020 and say, well, that was pretty crude, even then. And there's a great example that I use. It was a tweet, it was actually from last year. Somebody, I think she's an author, and this was very well known. They started off in 1994 as a online bookseller, so we know who I'm talking about. And of course, you know, if you buy anything there, then you're going to get the pop-up ads and the emails and so on and so forth. So she needed to buy herself a new toilet seat. That's a very practical thing that you need to buy. She just needed, and she needed one of them. And of course, what happened? She got all the follow-up pop-up ads and emails, and so she tweeted this and said, "Dear, you know, I'm not a toilet seat fetishist. You know, I don't have any sort of hankering to get another one. You know, it doesn't matter how many times you contact me. I'm really happy with just the one that I've got." And it kind of said, "But you know, this whole thing about personalisation needs to be relevant, and it needs to be in the moment and in context." And I think that's just around the corner. And when that starts to happen, actually, I think we'll get real value delivered to us, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah. And talking about of the moment, I think sustainability is one of those topics that is at the heart of retail at the moment. And I think one of the things for me is essentially lots of consumers talk about caring about sustainability and ethical sourcing, but the reality is, would they be prepared to pay for it? Would they actually be prepared to pay additional or extra for to either switch brands or pay extra for particular products that are sustainably and ethically sourced? What are your views on that?
Yeah.
Well, I started my retail journey as one of the first females sourcing in Guangzhou, China. And I watched this factory evolve overnight because there was going to be a very famous retailer come to do a factory inspection with plastic shoes and eye goggles and everything. Then they were all thrown, and very young members of staff, and being polite, came out then back into the factory floor, and they were tipping all the dye straight into the paddy field next door. And this was a retail brand who had great pride in their ethical and environmental stance. And one could argue, well, the factory has not presented itself fairly, so how could they truly know? And one can say, did they really do the diligence to know what the factory looked like? Were they just greenwashing? And I think the consumer expect this respectful and fair relationship, and they want more information as they become more aware of the devastating effects, and we call it the blue planet effect. You know, people suddenly are very much more aware of this. But they feel a lot of this should be at the manufacturer and retailer's cost. They believe they should be just doing it right to start with. When we did tests, and this is probably 15, 20 years ago, we always used to talk about no more than 5% would pay any more for something that was E&E. I think that's changed now. I've definitely looked into new research, millennials saying that. But there is this pick and mix culture, and you can't deny that. We can't not accept that. It's not a case of telling consumers off. That's their will, that's their way. Sometimes they're buying oodles of plastic and want the latest neon inflatable swan to do their pool Instagram shot on, and the next minute they're talking about wholeheartedly they don't want to see another coffee cup that can't be recycled. And we can't critique, well, we can critique you personally, but as businesses we have to say, well, this is the state of play we're given, how do we do this? And what I feel is uncomfortable at the moment is that retailers and manufacturers are nervous and concerned and therefore holding everything back. And I think it would be fairer and better to say, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we have to tell you about the stages that we're going through and the developments that we're making stage by stage by stage, and help guide us. What would you prefer? Would you prefer this or this as an environmental ethical option? Tell us and we will choose that one, but we can't have both right now and still deliver you for £5 or a pound bikini. So I think this is much more about mutual conversation between consumer, retail, manufacturer, and being realistic rather than actually just overpromise again and you're not delivering any of it.
I don't know if anybody here has seen, I think it was yesterday, I watched it this morning on the train, the address, if you can call it that Greta Thunberg gave at the climate change conference. Did anybody see that? She was an angry young lady, and I think "How dare you" is now trending as a hashtag on Twitter. So she really, be very interesting to know who wrote her script. But at the same time, we can be as cynical as we like. But I think that it is right that climate change, what we're doing to the planet, sustainability is very, very high on the agenda. Whether it's right to the top yet, I'm not sure about. But yeah, it is this dichotomy that you've got. If you asked everybody in this room, if you asked, did any sort of straw poll, I'm sure everybody would say yes, we care about the planet and we try to be support sustainability and so on and so forth. But then when you look at their own personal buying habits, it's sometimes very difficult. I mean, I was at a dinner yesterday evening and chatting to one or two people, and somebody came out with a statistic which I admit I wasn't necessarily aware of, that it might have been from their particular brand. It was a large UK supermarket, and they said that I think it was of their customers, 25% had just £5 left over at the end of every week. Now, that being the case, are you going to care about what you're doing to the planet? You're probably going to think, well, no, that's for somebody else who can afford perhaps to pay the perceived premium for it. So it is a difficult one, and I think that change won't happen unless there is more of a stick than a carrot, so legislation. So if we think back to, for those of us old enough to remember when we were all told that we really should put our seatbelts on when we got in the car, and there was a very famous campaign run by somebody who I won't name because we've forgotten about him. But it was to teach us to, but that carrot became a stick, and I think now we all put our seatbelt on, and it's socially unacceptable to drink and drive and to speed and these sorts of things. I think that what we will start to see, and I think you're right, Kate, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're going to see that shift, and it will become socially unacceptable to be seen with whatever it happens to be, whether it be a plastic straw or a plastic coffee cup or what have you.
And what I would add to that as well is I think that there will be this kind of tipping point, if you like, where that's social acceptance of the way that we consume products will change. And I think that actually offers an opportunity for retailers who can put sustainability and ethical sourcing at the heart of their business to create a point of differentiation, to have their greener credentials against their kind of greyer, polluting competitors. And actually I think the role of sustainable influencers, I think, will also become more prominent, where retailers will be using sustainable influencers to really build that ethical and sustainability values into the brand. And I genuinely believe that I'm not sure if we're there yet, but we're approaching a point in time where retailers can really use that as a point of differentiation to stand out from their competitors. So, and talking about a point of differentiation, some of what I spoke about earlier is challenges on the high street are tough. Profitability is under intense pressure, and a lot of the pressure is being felt on the high street. rising costs, shift in consumer shopping behaviour, rising vacancy rates, landlords that are under trouble. What does that spell for our high streets in the UK? Are they dead or dying?
No, as I mentioned earlier, my sort of preamble, no, they're not. Although, yeah, it'd be very easy to make a case for that. But what's happening, I think, what we're living through, what we're seeing is a period of probably unprecedented levels of change and the pace of that change. I think that on the one hand, no, the high street isn't dying, and certainly retail isn't dying. That's clear. But it does need some help. It does need some support. So, as an example, that you mentioned rising costs, and whereas rent isn't too bad, rates, we can't have a conversation like this without mentioning business rates, because I think it's important. It's an important issue, and it's one that's being largely ignored. And for me, the Future High Street Fund, I'm sorry, but that just doesn't cut it when you consider that retail contributes around about 8 billion. Total business rate I think is about 30, but retail itself is about 8, and that was less than $1 billion in that fund, which I don't think is going to be. I know the decisions as to how that will be awarded, if you like, aren't going to be made until at least next spring. On that subject as well, you hear a lot about how are we going to resolve that, and then you hear people talking about online sales tax, which for me is just crazy, because for a start, where's the sales attribution now? Because we talked about customer journey. That journey can start and end anywhere, and it can go through a myriad of different so how on earth do you decide what is online and what isn't now? It's all becoming one. It's all just shopping. So I think that the high street does need support. It needs it quite urgently. But at the same time, yes, there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's this natural process of evolution happening. Let's be honest, there is some poor retail out there. We can't hide that. We shouldn't gloss over that. I far prefer to talk about the great retail out there, and there's plenty of examples of that. But yes, there's it's kind of poor, lazy would probably be another word for it, and it's just simply hasn't moved with us, because I think that us as the consumer, we are the biggest disruptor. Nobody else, it's us, and I think we've kind of touched on some of those reasons for that, and that's having a profound impact on the high street.
So just on this, so that's quite a kind of upbeat, positive, optimistic view.
Some would say naive.
But it's the reality that we're just going to have fewer high streets, though, in the UK.
I'm not sure we're going to have fewer high streets, because as I said earlier, the high street equals the centre of the town centre, and vice versa. So I'm not sure whether we're going to have different. So we're going to see a far greater mix. So if we think back, over decades, the high street is largely equal retail. Then it became, obviously we had estate agents and charity shops. We know why we have plenty of charity shops, and hairdressers, and probably the only thing you can't get online at the moment. But I don't think there'll necessarily be less high streets, but there will be that different mix. So I'll have more wellness, it could be gyms or other sorts of things, office, residential, and that's not necessarily a bad thing when you think that if that brings people in, well, they're going to need to be fed and entertained and so forth. So we're just seeing a different mix.
Okay.
I really believe in our high streets, and I really believe that it is a social issue. We can't look at retailers and say, you have to remedy all of this. This is your problem, this is your creating, mend it. Because our high streets of the future are going to be community zones. They are not going to be purely retail focused. And we've got to go through that transition. Do we have the right people in local authorities who've got the experience to have the vision to see what that could be? Not in every case. even a lot of the bid teams are made up from a very retail base, and I don't believe the answer is retail. So we have two major crises I touched on earlier. We have an isolation crisis, which I think is absolutely borne out the fact that we've got jeopardy on the high street because we're just not pulling people together as much. And we've also got health, mental health and obesity crisis, all which could create much more support if there was a community there with green places, green spaces, opportunities for communities to get involved. And there's this brilliant author from the 60s that said, you know, places should be built by the people who use them, paraphrasing. And I really believe in that. I don't think there's anywhere near enough public involvement with what they want it to be. That has to happen too. Do I believe that retailers could have had a golden moment that they've missed? I think a lot of them have, because I think the good times, the cash was taken and dividend out, and I don't think it was reinvested enough in the future. It was hard for them to dictate what all of the future could look like, but I think they definitely could have seen some of it in the crystal ball. I don't think retailers are still engaging with it. I don't think they're looking at their operation hours. I don't think they're looking about their community focus. I don't think they're making the vanilla state high street we got, where you actually got off a train in the UK and didn't even know where you were anymore because it all just looked homogenised. I don't think they did enough to create that idea of communities having the DNA that they should have of towns and place. But I don't think we can wag our fingers purely at retailers. I am really nervous because I've been involved with local authority, I've been involved with placemakers, I've been involved with retailers. There's just not enough cohesion. People are not working together enough, and it won't be the downfall of high streets and place in 10 years' time because it couldn't be done. It will be the downfall because not enough people in the right places got together with the right experience to say this is a common issue and it will only be solved by all of us doing this. So as a retail and service industry advisor, my most predominant work in the last 10 years has been building alliances with the sporting industry, which has been really difficult because it's a very different mindset, a very different industry, but I've built them now, they're robust. So I can start understanding how I can build a running track into a town centre and within the isolation and community purpose in charities, so that I can understand how do you solve a problem like loneliness. And I'm actually using those now to start pulling them together to try and work on how can I get all of these people in the same room to start the conversation.
I think one of the things that resonated with me, you talk about cohesion, and I think one of the biggest challenges in repurposing high streets and making them fit for purpose and relevant to their local communities in many senses, because we're just dealing with so many different stakeholders, especially on high streets. Any typical high street might have tens if not hundreds of different landlords that have different objectives, that have different levels of skin in the game. To try to coordinate a common objective around so many different stakeholders, I think will be incredibly challenging. I completely agree with your point about repurposing high streets to include more leisure, more residential, and a different blend of retail. And if you look at the high streets in secondary locations that are still faring well against all of the structural change, they usually are those high streets that are either near transport hubs or where people live or work. And I think, and I can see as well, that for some shopping centres that are under pressure, I think that all of those characteristics of a different blend of office space or residential and things like that, we'd almost have a situation where some landlords will have to invest in creating almost bespoke community purposed centres, where shopping centres will be turned into kind of residential areas where actually the tenants, the residential tenants, will be there that kind of pay a service charge that covers all of their kind of multimedia, their Sky subscription, their weird gym in the building. They will cover cleaning expenses and utility bills and things like that, where the landlord can buy and share those economies of scale to make for cheaper accommodation, where all of the residents are essentially serving the retail that's within that scheme as well.
So we need to talk about the retailers themselves in terms of how they define, I guess, reassess their value, their purpose. What 2020, that's the idea of it. What's the big picture? Obviously we can't go through the detail of every single retailer and their individual plans, But if you were sat as CEO of a retail organisation and you're creating your 2020 Beyond plan, 2030 Beyond, how do you create a purpose that's going to be profitable, that's going to have purpose, that's going to have fit for the consumers that are ever changing, Andrew?
Well, I think one of the, to pick up just kind of on the property angle of it, because what we've been seeing over the last number of years is that, or I'll start again, go back before that, and we saw leases which were very, very long, typically 20, 25 years. So that was, and what we're seeing now is that the average is around about 7, I think it's 7.2, something like that. So it's becoming more agile. We know that in the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth, success and growth was seen as opening more stores, and of course now what we're seeing is a reset on that, and people are realising that they have too much space, and that's well documented. So realising the value, one interesting example that opened up a couple of weeks ago. This is Puma opened up a new flagship on Fifth Avenue, and you go in there and they have what they call a skill cube. And basically, Puma have a number of sporting ambassadors, footballers, and they have motor racing, Lewis Hamilton, and so forth. And so in virtual and augmented, and any other, you go in and you have a training session with them. And when you listen to what Puma have to say about this and why they've done this, this is all about engaging, using the store, the physical, to engage their fans, or their customers. There's their language. Their fans, and I think that the good news is that yes, there'll be less stores, but they'll be far better, because the store will be the physical embodiment of the brand, and that's where you can really understand your customer and what they want and the way that they want to interact and engage. Yes, we can glean an awful lot from behaviour online. I think what we will see far more of is the same sort of analytics being played out as to how we shop a store, how we navigate dwell time, etc., etc., and then linking that with marketing, merchandising, commercial functions to really understand how and what we want out of the store.
Is it about creating fans, Richard?
I think it is, yeah. No, I think it's about creating fans through meaningful experiences within physical locations, but also digital platforms and merging the two together. I think from a retailer point of view, the way that they look at stores and value stores and perceive the purpose of stores is changing. And I think that that kind of shift in mindset is more towards looking at stores, using a kind of digital analogy, as kind of cost per acquisition. These are customers that come into store that you can have an immersive experience with the brand, build that loyalty. They may not shop in that store, they might not buy anything on that occasion, but it doesn't matter. It's about being able to, and we know this is happening now. You walk into any store and people are on their mobile phones. They might be buying from that store, they might be buying from something from a different store, from a competitor. But the fact is, consumers just bounce across different physical and digital channels. But the main thing is that we might spend more time online. So the evidence shows that we spend more time online browsing for retail products. That might be on retailers' websites, that might be on social media platforms or marketplaces, whatever it might be. But actually, the physical experience of entering a store is more impactful on the path to purchase than digital platforms. And so this is why it's so important to have that for retailers, and of course this is happening, is that shift in mindset towards what is the value of the store. And it is about building the brand, about the experience, and looking at the store as a cost per acquisition, as a marketing expense, rather than those traditional metrics like sales per square foot and all of the others that essentially are redundant now.
I think if I was in that position, I would also be looking at creating partnerships. I think it's too tough alone. I think the next 10 years are going to be too challenging. And I think I would be picking up the phone and thinking, who's complementary, non-conflicting to me, that I could actually start to work and be that sharing space. So for instance, you've got the Disney and Primark experience, so you've got Disney and Target experience. So Disney are not going to roll any more stores out in the UK of their own brand in at any time soon, as I understand, but they've got these areas where they can't service with a physical retail presence, where they're doing it with partners. And I just think, we know this is done with the design partnerships. You're always seeing singers and sports people tying up with the brands. Why not the brands tying up with the brands? As long as it's not going to eat into your market share, this is an opportunity to start looking at that space and repurposing the space, making the events better, talking to people and say, we have synergy, just like you're connecting through social media, we're connecting too. And it doesn't have to be all long term, it can be short term as well as longer term. But I think we've just got to actually take practices. The car industry does this, you will go to each other's factories, you will share knowledge. It's the food industry as well. We have to start using this ability. We can't keep the silo mentality of, I want to be a generalist. If I can sell just one more of your products, I'm going to be happy doing that, and I'm going to go this solo account alone. I actually think it's time to say, no, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to be brilliant at? And how then can we widen our opportunity to talk to people by actually building bridges? And I just think it's time for retail to build bridges. But one of the fundamentals of traditional retail is property. We know that we've got 1 in 4 stores closed, we've got 12 store closures a day. It's the doom and gloom, it's the headline that runs and runs and runs. So what is the retail property landscape going to look like in the next 10 years, Richard, and how do we actually start to see some change there?
I think we touched on a lot of these themes already about the changing mix, the purpose of the high street changing, things like that. So I'll focus on something slightly different, which is I think the economics of store-based retailing has changed and is changing. All of the metrics around kind of rental costs or investment expectations, the space that we have in retail capacity has pushed rental costs down. I think that will allow new retailers, independent retailers, to be able to occupy physical spaces that are commercially viable. Dovetailed with having an online presence and being able to offer extreme convenience in many cases. So I think, and I can't remember who mentioned this before, but essentially the concept of we went through the last decade of rapid expansion of physical space. It was all about land grab and to increase market share. It was all about having more stores. And of course we've seen a reversal of many of those trends now. And I think we will see a reversal of clone high streets, where we'll have a much bigger presence of independent retailers. Also with service provision, so the hairdressers, the beauty salons, and the more experiential leisure element of that as well. And actually, if you look at some of the data around the number of stores, it's actually increasing. We've got more retail stores today than we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's just the mix of the stores is changing, and the polarization in terms of the flagship versus some of those secondary locations is changing. The number of stores occupied by large multiple retailers is consistently falling because of all the challenges that we spoke about, but that gap is being plugged by independent retailers. And I think that's going to be the major shift in terms of the visible shift that we're seeing on high streets.
Yeah. I was talking to someone just the other day, and she's based just outside Manchester. And anyway, well,
not in the north.
In the north, yeah, anywhere north of Watford isn't.
Were you all right speaking to her?
fascinating talking to her because she's putting pop-ups into existing large, well-known department stores using that space. And I thought, I need to talk to her again because it's a fascinating, for me, really interesting, one that she is being allowed to do it and that they are allowing her, these big brands are allowing her to do this. So, and we've seen one actually in the store at Oxford Circus with Topshop. So that's, but more than that, more than pop-ups. So the answer isn't, we're going to have our high streets, completely overrun with pop-ups. That won't happen. But I think it's quite interesting, exciting. But also, to your point, Richard, that I think we're going to see that the mix of the high street will change, and there'll be more, hopefully, independent, which means, because I don't know about you, but most high streets, you know what you're going to come across, and then you come across one which this is different. This is all mainly independents, and it's great because you just don't know what's around the corner, and you get kind of like curious and so forth. And I think for me that's a large part of what's gone out of a lot of retailing and retailers and needs to come back. And I think we're starting to see that come back, and that's that element of intrigue and curiosity, and inspire me, make me want, because I've got so many inputs coming at me, digital or otherwise, every day. All these things which are trying to grab my attention and grab my wallet and so on and so forth. So I want you to inspire me, and hopefully we'll start to see that on the high street.
So we are about to commit on social media, so you can't change your mind. These are going out right now. We've got to commit our hopes for 2020, our recommendations for 2020 directly out there, which we're going to do. And then we're going to ask if there are any questions from the audience, or if it's easier, we can just have a coffee with you afterwards. So before I do that, I'd really, really like to thank Andrew and Richard for their brilliant insight. I know we don't get a chance to be in the physically same room and the same time together because we're normally all doing the same sort of thing, but it's a joy to spend time, really listen to your expertise and influence and see how these very different paths have ended up bringing us to this point. I really hope that we can continue to help our retail clients and our service clients, and certainly learn all the way through. Just keep adapting for that. So 2020 and beyond, Andrew, succinctly, what are your tips, recommendations for anyone who's on our live stream? Hello, live stream people as well, and are tweeting and things like that. What is it?
For me, it's very simple, and it's summed up in one word, two actually. Be relevant. Relevance. For me, that's the key, because that goes back to an awful lot of things that we've been talking about. It means being in the moment. It means adding value. It means being within the context. So if you think about, and what I say to people is, think about your own experiences with brands, with retailers, and where it's really meant something and where it hasn't. Usually where it's really meant something, it's added value, will be where it's been relevant to me as the customer. And I think that it's exciting, because I think that's what we're seeing more of, and we're going to see more and more of. So 2020, be relevant.
Thank you.
So if you look at the retailers that are doing well at the moment, JD Sports, Selfridges, Aldi, Lidl, Boohoo, Primark, some of them are pure online retailers. Some of them, Primark, don't have a transactional e-commerce website. Some of them are the dreaded word, omnichannel, multi-channel, but operate in physical and digital realms. But the common characteristics, the common theme that you can tie with all of these retailers is that they're relevant to their consumers. They have a unique proposition that stands out in the market. They have values that they actually believe and stand for, and they understand their customers. So it's kind of a bit of retail 101, but that's what I truly believe.
And I have a plea that it's time to come together. It really is, because we need to have these towns and cities and places to live in, to be with one another. We need some harmony. We need to show in the business world that we can do this and be grown up about it, and we can learn from each other. So whether that's a retailer outreaching to a charity and making them actually physically part of their business rather than just donating to them, whether it's about two businesses coming together with synergy, or it's going back to those 1,000 independent retailers we're working here. They were learning the hard way, but they're actually delivering on it, and just saying we're part of the community, we all have a share in this, we need to deliver and put back. I think it's about coming together. I would absolutely love to see far more partnerships and alliances in retail, just the same way that we have today. So thanks very much for those tips. Audience, if there are any questions, we'd be very happy to take them. If not, if you'd like to have a coffee, we can have a chat with you till the end of the event. But thanks very much for coming and braving fire, rain, media onslaught, and everything else you've had to face to get here. Are there any questions?
I've got one if you don't mind, and it's for Andrew or Richard. We've seen so many companies talk about sustainability, many CEOs are making really big commitments, but how do you think that aligns with the need to deliver profit and shareholder value?
I think that's the challenge that they got. It's a balance. I think, as we were saying earlier, it's for a lot of people in the population. As shoppers, as consumers, they're when push comes to shove, even though they want to, they want to do the right thing by the planet and so forth, the home economics and budget just doesn't allow that. But I think that the direction of travel is that it will, as I think as Richard was saying earlier, it will become a point of differentiation which will matter, and it will eventually, when that'll be, I don't know, it'll probably be not in the next 5 years, probably 10, where it becomes a commercial point of differentiation. And as I say, that might well be on the back of different legislation. That could be through whatever, taxation on a plastic coffee cup. I don't know, but there are plenty of examples. So I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, but at the moment it's probably not going to drive the bottom line too much.
And so I'd echo some of those comments, and I think if you essentially ask consumers what do they prioritise more, is it sustainability or is it price and value? Most say price and value, and that's in a kind of an anonymous survey, and the reality is what consumers say they are going to do and what they do in reality are two completely different things. It's what behavioural economists call the intentions behaviour gap. So it kind of explains why I talk about doing exercise and then hardly ever go to the gym. Got good intentions, but yeah, the actions aren't met. So I think conceptually, I think that is definitely true of sustainability, and that's why I don't think we've reached that point of being able to make sustainability, ethical sourcing a point of differentiation that can be commercially viable. Of course, it depends on price point, products, what sector you're operating in as well. And the other thing, of course, is just your core customer base and who they are. And I guess I won't answer I'll pose a question rather than answer it. But M&S are going through immense kind of challenges at the moment. Their plan A was one of the things that they wanted to create as a point of differentiation. They're out there charging for plastic bags before it became mandatory and things like that. They had arguably the right customer base with the disposable income to be able to afford to pay more for things like that. So it might be a failure in their execution rather than other motives. But the point being is that they were kind of seen as one of the most sustainable retailers with all of their efforts around Plan A and things like that. It hasn't necessarily benefited them from a commercial sense.
I just have a question on, Richard, you mentioned earlier that you see 50% of retail being online in the next 10 years. Presumably that's not as relevant to some subcategories as others. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit of analysis on that. And then on the property side, you've also spoken a bit about how there's obviously overcapacity in the retail market, and leases terms are changing. We know that H&M are looking at pushing into turnover rents, where returns are deducted and including online. I mean, how do you see that sort of taking on across the rest of the market?
So, yeah, I think that we're in a position where, like I say, if you ask consumers what is holding back further online shopping, it's all around delivery. They want cheaper, faster, and easy returns, and actually first-time delivery rates. And so I think there's a number of factors here, but I think demographic shifts is a key one. So Gen Zs and millennials being 50% of the population in 10 years' time. I think that in-home delivery is another key is a key factor. So you look at some of the interesting things in terms of the partnership between Waitrose and Yale, where essentially Waitrose drivers are pulling up and typing in PIN codes and going into people's homes and putting away their groceries when they're not even in, and shutting the door and PIN code no longer works. Amazon Key is another example where Amazon drivers are fulfilling online orders without consumers being home. We've done some research and it suggests that about 1 in 6 consumers would be happy with the controlled and monitored access into their homes to fulfill online orders, and that rises to 1 in 5 for Gen Zs. And then if you look at some of the technology around streamlining distribution, you've got the Ocado warehouse, for example. That technology is just going to make it faster and cheaper to deliver goods. And then you've got further kind of horizon scanning in 10 years' time. What's going to happen with drone deliveries, for example? Of course, it's not relevant for all deliveries, but automated cars, robotics. You see Starship, for example, where in Milton Keynes you've got robots going around delivering things. I think that kind of thing will become mainstream. So it's really going to drive ultra convenience for online, and I think things like hour deliveries for some products will become a reality, where actually you won't need to go to physical stores to actually get even some distressed purchases. So that's that. Some of those combinations of why we think online has the potential to hit that point. As your point around kind of turnover-based rents, it's already becoming more commonplace. I think that obviously landlords and retailers have to work in partnership and have a relationship that's mutually beneficial to both parties. But there's challenges around online. How do you measure the impact of online when you know that consumers are going to visit stores and then continue their customer journey online? It's a fact that if you have a physical presence in a location that you haven't been in before, you get that halo effect of online sales. It's a challenging situation to kind of attribute the value on some of those stores in terms of rental.
I'd also add online as well. Consumers are still very frustrated in terms of the refund timing when they send an item back, and the waiting for that cash to be back, and they prefer, if it's something that they've invested in, that they can have the flexibility to be able to return multi-channel, omni-channel, because they can actually cut that loop down. So I think whilst that develops, then we'll see a lot of the finance bridges like Klarna's and others do more of that to help that. I think also humans are still humans. They're always still going to be forgetful. They're always going to break things. They're always going to need things last minute, and that's really where the convenience of the bricks and mortars need to present themselves in terms of their offer, and thinking about that logically. What stock should be there? It should be intelligent stock and purpose and service to suit that. I think for me, I don't believe landlords and retailers have worked as well together as they had and should have, and I think they could have laid a lot of this. I think those conversations will start to hit a point, hopefully, where they will see that there is a consumer-driven future and that they are two big cogs in that wheel.
I'll just pick up on what Richard said about delivery, because I think that will drive an awful lot of change and a big shift. So some of the things that you talked about there, I'm not convinced whether drones that are in the sky, but maybe there's certain use cases for that. But certainly the 1 hour delivery, and there's an Israeli startup called Common Sense. I think they've just renamed to Fabric for some unknown reason. Anyway, there's a underground car park in a tower block in Tel Aviv, and they've turned this into basically a mini distribution centre, fulfillment centre, so it can handle ambient, chilled, even frozen, and deliver within a certain radius, of which I think is something like 5 kilometres within the hour. And talking to them, their plan for that is that they'll have kind of like a hub and spoke, which first of all in Tel Aviv, but then their ambitions are far more global. And I'm naming them because I'm not aware of another one like that. And it appears that the differentiation is that whereas somebody like an Ocado needs a certain footprint, I think it's something like 120,000 square feet for theirs to work. This can be condensed into much, much smaller space. So if you imagine some of these empty stores on the high streets, we could have mini distribution centres which are then going to fulfil within that immediate area, and then you ring that town with more and more. And so in other words, the 1 hour, the expectation of a 1 hour, in this case grocery delivery, is becoming a reality, and will do so very, very quickly.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
We're going for it now, no problem.
A couple of observations to start off with. It's interesting what Andrew was saying earlier on. We're new into retail, and our mantra was to be interesting, intriguing and inspiring. And you mentioned 2 of those words, so we must be doing something correct on that. And the other one we've talked about with the landlords wanting to pinch some of the online sales. I've had this conversation with British Land a few times, that it works both ways. If you've got those interesting, intriguing, inspiring stores, that drives footfall back into the shopping centres as well. So I think we have to be careful that we don't look at it as the online businesses are having it away all the time and it's poor old retail. I think it disappoints me that there's a talk about tax on online sales. I think it's impractical, but it's also, if you saw the bill that we have for our print, postage and Google AdWords campaigns to run an online business, it's very, very difficult and expensive.
Yeah. Isn't it?
And I think that brings us to the final point we're talking about. We're new to this, so the P&L for us is quite important. The pressure is, obviously, turnover is one of the bigger drivers, which we're trying to focus on at the moment. Margin, the pressure there is with the ecological side of things and making sure that you're doing things right, because you lose margin when you try and resolve that issue. The next biggest one to us is the labour, the workforce, and we were chatting earlier on. If you want the right people in store, you have to pay for that. It drummed into me from the first store open that 13% of your net sales needs to be your labour cost. Well, you can't keep to that if you want the right people in store. We talked about the turnover rates. The last point I'm getting to is the only other thing here is rates. What do you think we can do to try and challenge the business rates? Because if you can sort of knock 40-50% on that, all of a sudden stores that are losing 20,000 then start making 30 and 40, and that will allow us to be able to open more stores.
Well, I mean, I was making the point, I didn't kind of finish it, I guess, on that in terms of when I was talking about online sales tax, and the fact that I don't think that's the answer. I think all you need to do is look at the current system of business rates, which was devised in 1988, I think it was introduced in 1990. And of course that was 4 years before Amazon and eBay were around. So obviously the world was completely different then. And I think what we need to have is a level playing field. So everybody is playing by the same rules. Because at the moment it's a bit like Manchester City playing a fourth division, and the fourth division's got its one arm tied behind their backs or whatever, or whoever you care to. So I think that it's creating that level playing field, because then I still think that we'll see the strong retailers, the good retailers, call it what you like, will survive, and the weaker ones may or may not. But at least they're all being able to compete on the same basis. But of course that needs central government intervention, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately.
Fit for purpose, it's got to be fit for purpose, and it no longer is. It's, you know, very different part of life that I'm dealing with right now, but we've not had a reform in terms of the way we teach and interact with sports in school kids for 20 years, before technology, before smartphones, before the way that young people live their life. It's just no longer fit for purpose, and it needs reform, and it needs it soon. But unfortunately, due to the churn of ministers, we seem to be distracted, and we promised we wouldn't mention certain words, but that was our pledge before we started. But you know, we actually need to work out that these things are long-term changes, and they need some short-term measures too, and it's time.
Yeah, and just picking up on that theme, the issue is it's just a reliable tax income for the government. You can't up and move property and stick it overseas. So yeah, I think it contributes around 30 billion-ish to the Exchequer every year. And yeah, the BRC have done incredible amount of work in trying to raise this as an issue. They've been plugging away at government and various ministers, and I think your point around a changing team of people that you constantly have to engage with is a real challenge. But the issue is there isn't a desire within government to change this, because it's an incredibly complex problem. And how do they reduce business rates and make that tax neutral? Because the tax has to go somewhere else, someone has to pay for it. And so whether that gets distributed to a different tax, VAT, goes to a sales tax, it goes somewhere else. So it has to be distributed somewhere, and that's the core of the issue. There isn't a desire to do that.
I mean, it seems to me that central government doesn't see it in the same way that I personally think they were quite right not to intervene in what happened yesterday with Thomas Cook. But they seem to think that, oh, this is a problem for retail, it's nothing to do with us, and they'll just keep on taking our 30 billion or whatever. Well, actually, and this is really to what you were saying, Kate, about the fact that it's all about the communities. This is a social problem. Yes, it is everything to do with central government and local government and a lot of other stakeholders, as you were saying, Richard. And I think this is the frustration for me, that doesn't seem to be accepted, because, well, we're still getting the same revenue, so we're happy. So we'll just let it.
We must finish, but thank you very much for the questions. Please do take large refills to get you on your way today. Apparently the weather's going to be miserable, but we're not. So thank you very much for your time. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you.